The UN chamber, bathed in diplomatic formality, felt colder than usual. Not because of the air conditioning, but because of what had just been said. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stood behind the podium, his voice firm, unwavering, and to some, unforgiving. There will be no retreat. Gaza will continue to be neutralized, he said. We do not negotiate with chaos. The murmurs that followed weren't surprise, they were fatigue. Same war. Same words. But in the second row, Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat forward, eyes narrowed, fingers clasped, waiting. Across the room, the tension began to calcify. Delegates glanced between papers and translators, waiting for the next speaker. But what none of them expected was what came next. Traoré, slowly rising to his feet, not waiting for his name to be called. No retreat? Traoré asked aloud. Then no mercy will find you either. Heads turned. This wasn't scheduled. This wasn't diplomatic. This was defiance. Netanyahu paused, lips tightening. Traoré's footsteps echoed as he approached the front, not the podium, but the space directly in front of Netanyahu's delegation. You speak of order, Traoré said, but drop bombs on hospitals. You speak of defense, but silence the voices of children buried beneath rubble. Gasps. Some from indignation, others from realization. Netanyahu clenched the sides of his seat, but said nothing. Traoré was now commanding the room, and everyone could feel the shift. This chamber, Traoré continued, was built to prevent another century of bloodshed. But all it seems to do is delay its condemnation until the killing is complete. Silence. He turned, meeting the eyes of delegates from France, the UK, and the US. Your missiles hit Gaza, he said. But your silence hits humanity. As he returned to his seat, a thunderous pause followed, not applause, not yet. But something had broken, a pattern, a ritual, and the world would soon feel the aftershock. Backstage chaos followed. Delegates whispered, some into their sleeves, others into phones. News outlets scrambled to cut the footage and roll it into live headlines. Burkina Faso's Traoré challenges Netanyahu at UN was already trending across major platforms. Netanyahu stood again, not to respond to Traoré, but to reclaim control of the narrative. He cleared his throat. This is not the place for dramatics. Israel acts in self-defense. We don't need lectures from nations who have never known the threat of missiles raining over their children. The implication was clear. But Traoré didn't flinch. From his seat, Traoré raised his hand, not to interrupt, but to signal something deeper. Composure. Resolve. And a warning that hadn't finished speaking yet. I may not know what it's like to have missiles fly over my head, Traoré said calmly, but I know what it's like to have my people's bones beneath someone else's boots. A hush fell again. This time it was deeper, more uncomfortable. You think we haven't seen bombs? Traoré continued. We've buried children in Ouagadougou too, children the West labeled collateral damage, when they tested their so-called anti-terror strategies on African soil. The accusation wasn't just for Netanyahu anymore. It was for everyone who sat comfortably behind a national flag, watching injustice like it was a distant broadcast. Pam Bondi leaned in. Macron lowered his eyes. Even the US delegate seemed unsure of whether to look offended or ashamed. And Traoré? He wasn't finished. You claim Gaza breeds terrorism, he said, standing once more. But what you plant with fire, you harvest in rage. And rage, once global, doesn't knock on borders, it breaks them. Gasps echoed across the room, but this time, they weren't met with condemnation. They were met with unease, because somewhere in Traoré's voice was a prophecy that felt all too possible. He turned, locked eyes with Netanyahu, and added, keep bombing if you must, but don't act surprised when the world starts to push back. Netanyahu's jaw tightened as if each word from Traoré was a blade dragging across decades of diplomatic armor. The Prime Minister leaned slightly forward, no longer addressing the room, but addressing Traoré directly. You don't understand the cost of restraint, Netanyahu hissed. We hold back more than the world will ever know. Traoré blinked slowly, then stood again, not in anger, but with the measured calm of someone who had lived through more than one empire's arrogance. I understand restraint, Traoré replied. It's what Africa was forced to practice every time we were pillaged, colonized, and told to smile for aid money. That was it. The mask had dropped. Let me be clear, he continued, voice now rising like a storm. We are done being polite while watching funeral processions. Africa's silence is over. And if Gaza burns tonight, tomorrow we raise our voices, with fire, with sanctions, with the kind of unity that makes even the most untouchable nations shiver. The hall rippled with murmurs. A few delegates stood. The Kenyan representative nodded solemnly. The South African envoy placed a hand over her heart. Even the Venezuelan ambassador whispered something into a camera's reach. Finally, someone said it. Netanyahu attempted to reply, but this time Traoré didn't wait. You speak of terrorists, he said. But what do you call a government that drops bombs on a people it has caged for decades? Netanyahu remained silent. Traoré continued, what do you call leaders who act like punishment is a strategy, who erase children's futures and call it defense? Still, no response. History will remember Gaza, Traoré declared, but it will remember who watched and who stood. And at that moment, the cameras turned, not just toward Netanyahu, but toward the room. Delegates. Silence. And then, claps. Sparse. Nervous. But real. And growing. Traoré didn't smile. He wasn't here for applause. He was here because someone had to break the damn silence. The applause, hesitant at first, grew bolder with every second. It wasn't the kind of clapping that followed policy. It was the sound of a room cracking under moral pressure. Not everyone joined, but those who did so not because they agreed with Traoré's politics, but because they felt what he said was true. Netanyahu didn't hide his disgust. He leaned toward his advisor, whispering in Hebrew. The translator devices crackled. Traoré simply watched, calm, steady. As if he had waited for this confrontation his entire life. Then, in a rare move, Netanyahu abandoned his prepared remarks. He returned to the podium with fire behind his eyes. You lecture from a nation still fighting to stabilize its own soil, he snapped. You claim moral clarity while terrorists dance on rooftops with your flag. The words hung heavy, barbed. Designed to humiliate. But Traoré remained unmoved. You see shadows where there are people, he replied coolly. You see resistance and call it chaos. You see justice, and you run. A silence deeper than before fell. For the first time, Netanyahu looked unsettled, not by the words, but by the reaction of those around him. Poland's delegate crossed his arms. Brazil's ambassador shook her head. Even a few American officials shifted in their seats. You wanted Gaza quiet? Traoré asked. Then feed it, heal it, recognize its people. But bombing silence into the earth only echoes louder than you can handle. Traoré slowly approached the center of the floor. No podium, no papers, just presence. You said restraint has a cost, he said. So does cruelty. Then he turned to the entire hall. And the world is starting to tally the debt. A flicker of movement caught his eye. A young journalist, barely out of college, stood filming with teary eyes. It wasn't just history being made. It was the moment someone finally said what the world was too afraid to say out loud. The room wasn't just quiet, it was listening. That distinction mattered. Netanyahu, for all his iron stance and polished defiance, suddenly looked smaller beneath the bright UN lights. Not because he had been defeated, but because for the first time in years, he had been defied. Publicly, on moral grounds, and the world was watching. CNN cameras zoomed in on Traoré's face. Al Jazeera aired it live in Arabic, English, and French. TikToks with subtitles in Korean and Swahili began circulating within minutes. The moment was no longer confined to the chamber, it was global. And Traoré? He wasn't done. I come from a land, he said, where we were once told what to think, what to mine, and who to obey. We buried that era. He turned back to Netanyahu. You're still trying to resurrect it. A few gasps. A few nods. But not one denial. Netanyahu opened his mouth, but no sound came. For the first time, the seasoned statesman known for his aggressive rhetoric found himself speechless, not because he lacked words, but because any word now would only add oxygen to Traoré's fire. Traoré took a step forward, slowly. "You say Israel cannot survive without its force," he said. "Then what do you call a nation that only breathes through war?" No one answered. "And if survival demands the crushing of another people's spirit," he said louder, "then maybe it's not survival at all. Maybe it's just slow death with a bigger budget." A wave of silence. Then, a delegate from Chile stood. "We support a ceasefire," she said clearly. Then Ghana. Then Norway. Then Indonesia. One after another, voices began rising, not in chaos, but in chorus. Traoré didn't move. He didn't raise a fist. He didn't shout. He had already spoken. And that was enough to shake the foundation of a chamber long deaf to the screams beyond its glass. The United Nations General Assembly had never been a place of quick decisions. It was a theater of patience, where words were filed into reports, diluted by diplomatic jargon, and forgotten by the time the ink dried. But this was different. Traoré had torn through that fabric of delay. His words weren't crafted for press releases. They were warnings. And the room knew it. Behind Netanyahu, aides began checking their phones with increasing urgency. Twitter, now X, was flooding with hashtag Traoré speaks. Global headlines were changing by the minute. Burkina Faso's leader challenges Israel head-on. UN shaken by Traoré's Gaza statement. Traoré remained composed, standing at the front without notes, without script, just intent. He took a breath and spoke again. "You think Gaza's rubble will quiet the people," he said. "But you misunderstand pain. Pain does not disappear, it teaches. And what you're teaching will not be forgotten." He turned to the hall again. "When my country was stripped of gold and dignity, we were told we were nothing. But we rose. So will they." A low murmur moved through the hall, not of resistance, but of reckoning. Netanyahu suddenly cut in. "So what would you have us do? Let Hamas fire rockets unchecked? Let tunnels flourish under our cities?" Traoré didn't flinch. "You build walls instead of bridges. You build fear, not peace. You build excuses. And now you ask why you're alone?" Silence. "I'm not defending Hamas," he clarified. "I'm defending the right of a people not to be turned into shadows just because they were born on the wrong side of a fence." That hit deeper than expected. The ambassador from Egypt placed his glasses on the table and whispered to his assistant, "He's changing the narrative." And he was. Traoré was no longer just speaking for Gaza, he was speaking to the world's pattern, the erasure of dignity in the name of order, the cost of silence disguised as neutrality. As Traoré's words spread beyond the walls of the United Nations, so too did the unrest they stirred. In the streets of Johannesburg, crowds gathered around televisions in shop windows. In Istanbul, university students shared subtitles of his speech on group chats. In Chicago, a black teenager posted a TikTok. "First time I've seen someone talk to power like that, and not flinch." Inside the assembly, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Netanyahu straightened his tie, jaw clenched. "We are a nation under attack," he said. "And no amount of poetic grandstanding changes that." Traoré walked slowly toward the edge of the stage, not confrontational, but deliberate. "If you are under attack," he said calmly, "then defend yourself. But do not pretend that starvation is self-defense. Do not claim that bombing children is strategy. Do not dress vengeance in the uniform of security." He paused, let the silence bloom. "Because if that's your definition of defense," he said softly, "then the world is beginning to wonder, who is the real threat?" The American delegation stirred, visibly uncomfortable. The U.S. ambassador whispered something into a staffer's ear and quickly scribbled a note. This wasn't going away. Traoré turned to the delegates, not just the powerful ones, but those from smaller, often ignored nations. You stayed quiet because you thought your voice didn't matter, he said. But silence, too, has a sound. It sounds like falling bombs. It sounds like dying children. He pointed, not accusingly, but truthfully. Silence is how genocide tiptoes past our conscience. Several ambassadors looked down. Some even stood. From the balcony, a protester unfurled a banner. Ceasefire now. Humanity first. Security moved in, but slowly. Even they seemed unsure which side history would fall on. Traoré didn't look up. He didn't need to. He had already lifted the ceiling off the room. By now, the chamber was no longer a diplomatic stage, it was a battlefield of truths. But no weapons were drawn, only words sharper than steel. Netanyahu leaned forward, his voice cold. What would you know of this, Captain? You lead a nation barely standing. Burkina Faso isn't Israel. You don't understand what it means to be constantly surrounded by enemies. Traoré nodded, slowly, as if granting the point its moment. You're right, he said. We are not Israel. We are not an occupying force. We are not backed by billions to enforce our will. We are not the ones with drones darkening skies over refugee camps. He stepped forward. We are the ones under your boots. The phrase hit with such force that several delegates audibly gasped. But Traoré wasn't done. You speak of enemies, he said. But sometimes, a mirror shows more truth than a map. Maybe the enemy is not surrounding you. Maybe it is who you become, when power becomes habit and fear becomes policy. A sharp silence. Then a flicker of applause, from Senegal. Then from Bolivia. Then from France. Netanyahu's fingers clenched around the podium. So you stand with terrorists, he hissed. Traoré's gaze didn't break. No. I stand with the children who never got to become poets. With the mothers who bury hope with every small body. I stand with the belief that security without humanity is not peace. It's prison. The applause grew louder. One by one, delegates who had sat silently began to rise, not in protest, but in acknowledgement. Even a few in the U.S. delegation hesitated. They were supposed to stay neutral. But neutrality was no longer an option when the building trembled not from bombs, but from truth. At that moment, Traoré looked less like a captain of a small African nation and more like the conscience of a world trying to forget it ever had one. By now, the air inside the chamber wasn't just tense, it was electric. Traoré stood still, but his presence swelled like thunderclouds ready to break. The gallery had gone quiet, even the translators had paused, momentarily lost in the weight of the moment. No one wanted to miss what would come next. Netanyahu's voice came low, like a man fighting for control. What gives you the right to lecture Israel on survival? Traoré didn't blink. He simply raised a finger. What gives you the right to bury survival beneath rubble? The words shattered through the hall. It wasn't just rhetoric anymore. It was confrontation, raw and direct. Traoré let the silence sit. Then he spoke again, slower now, quieter, but impossibly firm. When you destroy a man's home, he builds another. When you take his family, he buries them and lives with fire in his chest. But when you take his future, when you tell a child her life is a target, do not be surprised when that child grows teeth. Gasps again. Some delegates looked away, others leaned in, unable to detach themselves from the gravity of his words. Netanyahu folded his arms. So what? You threaten us now? Traoré's eyes narrowed. No, he said. I warn you. He let the word settle. Every missile you drop turns silence into rage. Every blockade you tighten turns hunger into resistance. And every lie you speak, about security, about morality, turns you from a victim, into the villain. The chamber, already stunned, now felt volatile. This wasn't diplomacy, it was reckoning. One ambassador whispered to another, "He's not just speaking for Gaza. He's speaking for everyone who's ever been told to stay in their place." And he was. In that room, among marble pillars and golden plaques, Traoré became more than a president or a soldier. He became the voice that said what too many had swallowed for too long. A truth too loud to ignore. The room was still, but the silence was not peace, it was the eye of the storm. A storm that had been centuries in the making. One built from imperial lies, from maps drawn in blood, from voices that had always been told to speak softly, or not at all. And yet here was Traoré. Not soft. Not quiet. Not shaking. Netanyahu gripped the podium with both hands. His voice trembled, not with fear, but fury. "You speak of consequences, Captain. Be careful. Israel has allies stronger than you can imagine." Traoré tilted his head, a faint, almost tragic smile on his face. "I've imagined them," he said. "I've seen them. I've watched them send tanks to silence orphans. I've watched them arm injustice and call it order. And I've watched them panic when one man, with no army behind him, stands up and tells the truth." He took a step closer to the center of the floor. This time, not just to speak, but to claim the space. As if the future itself had stepped into the room. "The world is changing," he said. "Empires are collapsing. Not from war, but from witness." Delegates looked at each other, some nodding, some blinking back the gravity. "You can bomb buildings. You can crush dissent. But you cannot kill memory. You cannot erase witness. And one day, when you are gone, history will not remember your excuses. It will remember the screams you ignored. And it will remember who stood up and said, 'Enough.'" At that moment, a voice from the back shouted, "Enough." Then another, "Ceasefire now." And another, "We stand with the children." The guards moved slowly, not to stop them, but to listen. Netanyahu said nothing. He turned to sit, but the chair behind him had been quietly removed by an aide, unsure if he should be standing. It was symbolic. Because in that chamber, before the world, Benjamin Netanyahu had just been dethroned by truth. Traoré didn't gloat. He simply turned and walked away. And as he passed the exit, cameras flashing like lightning, a journalist shouted, "Captain, what happens next?" Traoré paused only long enough to say, "Now, they decide. Whether peace lives, or dies."